Hi, my name is Fiona Giles. I'm a retired academic in feminist theory, cultural studies and literary journalism from the University of Sydney in Australia. I really define myself as a feminist writer, thinker and academic because it's the way I grew up. And the reason I'm telling you that is that it's really important when feminists speak that they acknowledge the personal in whatever they do and however they conduct their work and their life in general. The idea behind that is that the way we live, the values that we hold dear, and the work we do are all completely meshed together. We can't separate different parts of our lives into compartments, just as we can't separate our head from our heart. And neuroscience, of course, is backing us up more and more on that insight, which for many feminists was something that they contributed back in the second wave in the 1970s. So that was when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and it was a very exciting time to be a feminist and to be a writer. But I also, being young, wanted to be quite naughty, and I didn't like the dogma and the orthodoxy that came with some feminism. I was also particularly interested in how men dealt with feminism and social change and how we can bring them on board with us rather than alienate them or demonize them. So for a long time, particularly in the 1990s, I called myself a decadent feminist because I didn't quite subscribe to the correct line. And one of the books that I edited was called Dick for a Day. And the reason for that is that I wanted to just upset the apple cart and say, so what is it about men, and in particular their defining anatomical characteristic that women don't have? What is it about men that women might have, and how would it change their approach to the world? And again, I think using the idea of the body and embodiment is particularly important in my work and in feminism overall, although for a long time it was missing. And I think now it's come into the fore in a much bigger way, the understanding of how our bodies help make us individuals and how they help us to think and how cognition is throughout our bodies. So to get back to Dick for a Day, it was a playful attempt to really investigate, to explore, to have fun with an idea around what it would be like to be a man just for 24 hours. And then I did the equal opportunity sequel, which was called Chick for a Day, and I invited men to contribute. In these cases, poetry, fiction, nonfiction writing, essays, even a couple of very short answers. And what was interesting about Chick for a Day, as the equal opportunity sequel, as I like to call it, was that the men were incredibly respectful of women and their bodies and were just in awe of what it would be like to be a woman anatomically for that period of time. Whereas the women really had fun getting stuck into men, because I think what we were sort of discovering here, as you do with satire, is that people who don't have power tend to have a go at people who do have power. But what was lovely about the Chick for a Day collection is that the people who do have power showed incredible respect and reverence and curiosity about what it would be like to be a woman anatomically. And that to me really summed up an approach in my work that I've tried to hold on to. There are a couple of things actually. One is to keep men in the picture with feminist politics, to understand what makes men tick, and to make life better for men through feminism, not for them to fear that it will make life less enjoyable or fulfilling for men, that it would actually make life for men more rewarding. That's the first thing. And the second thing is I've always, as an academic, with a PhD from Oxford, which sounds really posh, but I've always wanted to write material that can be read by a wide audience. So for a feminist theorist and academic to do those two books, I really felt that I was doing something very important, even though they were kind of funny and silly at the same time. I've then gone on to do a lot of work about breastfeeding and women's sexuality, particularly mothers. And again, you can see the theme of the body and the personal in that work. And that, of course, happened, or maybe not, of course, but not surprisingly, when I had my first child, and I was invited to write about motherhood. And I said, actually, I don't really know much about motherhood. I've only just had my first child, but I'm fascinated by breastfeeding. And I went on to write an essay called Two Breasts, 12 Weeks about breastfeeding, which really inspired me to do more work. Because what I discovered as a young mum learning about breastfeeding and being a mum was that all the literature, or maybe 95% of the literature, was about the how-to guides, how to hold the baby and what were the nutritional benefits of breastfeeding. And there was some politics around Nestle and, formula being promoted as a substitute, which was clearly inadequate. But there were very little pieces about what it feels like and what it means to us as a culture, particularly in Western culture, where a lot of the skills and understanding about breastfeeding had been lost throughout the 20th century. So I put together a collection of stories based on interviews with women and men. Again, I wanted to keep men in the picture, about their breastfeeding experiences, and that's called Fresh Milk. And I wanted the narrative to be there so it would be of interest to general readers. But I also wanted there to be, there were little essays preceding each narrative, explaining what in that particular story was of interest to me in a broader cultural sense. So again, that's an example of feminist writer, which for me means being accessible, being personal, and also broadening the scope of our cultural understanding about both women and men and our bodies which we live in and which make us who we are. The other great thing about breastfeeding, which I then went on to explore in greater detail as an academic, was the way in which breastfeeding insists on the interdependence of humans. It insists on the fact that as subjects, we are not merely individuals. And there's so much focus on individualism in the West in particular. But I think we forget that our edges blur and that the people around us, even those people who we don't rub shoulders with every day, are part of us and how we understand who we are. Levinas, as the French philosopher, said, we actually learn about ethics through learning about ourselves, and we learn about ourselves through our relationships to others. And breastfeeding is the beginning of that adventure. It really helps us to understand also the role of the body in sustaining ourselves, each other, literally. I came across a beautiful word in my studies, and it comes from anthropology. A woman called Penny Van Estrik used it. She's an anthropologist who writes about breastfeeding in Canada. And she used the word commensality. And commensality is the opposite of being a parasite. Commensality is when people sit down together to eat, to talk, to converse, to cook, to share their company and their hospitality, to move away from being strangers, to become part of a group or part of a community or a friendship network. And what I love about the word is that it's really a definition of mutual benefit on the basis of giving. And I think that in these times when we're particularly anxious about the future, about the climate emergency, about our environment, about the coronavirus pandemic, about maintaining and preserving our health and our sense of self, we are also beginning to understand that interconnectedness and the very important and inevitable role that it plays in our lives, whether we want it to or not. So for me, breastfeeding became a much bigger topic about human conduct, about ethics, and about the role of the body and our personal lives in our social interaction and in our politics. So there you go, despite my naughtiness in the 90s and being a decadent feminist, I turned out to be pretty orthodox one after all. But I hope in that way that it brings pleasure. And that was the other important part of my work, that I wanted to really insist that breastfeeding be promoted as a form of pleasure, as a form of embodied affection, that men can also provide their bodies as maybe not with milk as food, but with comfort and warmth. And I really feel that's an important part of who we are, that we produce food for each other. that we are each other's sustenance, that we need each other, and that cooperation, collaboration, getting across those divides in the post-Trump world are just so important. Thank you.